Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life.
Picture a single grain of salt.
Okay.
Now, count out 12 of them. Just put them in the palm of your hand.
It's almost nothing. I mean, you can barely even see it.
Exactly. A light breath could just blow it away. But in the world of synthetic opioids, those 12 tiny grains, which is roughly 2 milligrams, that represents a lethal dose of fentanyl.
Yeah, it's a terrifying visual.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it just perfectly encapsulates the sheer scale and, the intensity of the crisis that has gripped this country over the last several years. So welcome to the deep dive. Today, we have a very specific mission for you.
Right. We are setting out to answer a question that honestly has been dominating public health discussions.
Yeah, a question that almost feels too good to be true, honestly. Have fentanyl overdose deaths actually gone down since 2021?
And, it is arguably the most consequential public health question of the decade. And to answer definitively, we aren't just relying on, a single isolated metric.
No, definitely not.
We're triangulating the truth using a really robust stack of recent sources.
Yeah, we're pulling directly from the DEA's 2025 National Drug Threat Assessment, which gives us that macro-level law enforcement perspective on global supply chains.
Right.
And we are also analyzing highly detailed state-level public health data from Connecticut, tracking mortality trends all the way up to January 2026.
Which is incredibly recent.
Super recent. And on top of that, we have this fascinating sociological criminology study out of the University of Maryland and some breaking medical news about a phase I human trial for a fentanyl vaccine that just launched in 2026.
Yeah, so whether you are actively tracking the epidemiology of this crisis or, you just want to understand the reality of what is happening in your own community, we really have you covered.
Absolutely.
And the subject matter is inherently heavy, obviously. But as we synthesize these sources, the overarching narrative that emerges is, well, it's fundamentally different than the grim trajectory we were charting just 2 or 3 years ago.
Okay, let's unpack this
Yeah.
because we need to start by answering that core question using the hard data. Did the deaths actually go down?
They did.
Whoa.
Yeah. And to understand the magnitude of this shift, we really have to look at the historical timeline first.
Yeah.
I mean, for an entire decade, the graph of overdose fatalities in the United States, it resembled a mountain with no peak.
It just kept going up.
Exactly. Mortality rate just kept compounding year after year, largely driven by, the proliferation of illicitly manufactured fentanyl. And the peak finally hit in 2022. With over 108,000 fatal overdoses nationally.
108,000. I'm looking at this CDC provisional data right now, and yeah, it shows a real decline after that.
Right.
Like in 2023, the national deaths fell to around 103,000. And then for 2024, the provisional numbers show them dropping under 100,000.
Yes, a huge shift.
And the trend actually accelerates. Right. By August 2025, the CDC reported an approximate 21% drop compared to the previous year, with fatalities falling in 45 states.
It's incredible.
It is, but I have to challenge the optimism just a little bit here because we are still talking about 80,000 to 100,000 dead Americans a year.
Yeah, of course.
That is basically a small city wiped off the map annually. So are we really celebrating a 21% drop when the baseline is that historically catastrophic?
Well, that is the vital caveat, right? We are not declaring victory, but we are recognizing statistical significance. What's fascinating here is the sustained nature of the decline.
Okay, what do you mean by sustained?
Well, we have to consider how provisional data works. Coroner reports and complex toxicology screenings, they often take months to finalize.
Right, so the early numbers are usually low.
Exactly. Early data usually undercounts the true toll. But even factoring in those reporting lags, October 2024 marked the 11th consecutive month of sweeping reductions reported by the CDC.
Wow, 11 months in a row.
Yeah, this is the first sustained national downward trajectory we have seen since 2018. And, we see this mirrored perfectly in our microcosm data from Connecticut, which recorded a 26.1% decrease in drug overdose deaths from 2023 to 2024.
That's a massive drop for one state.
It is, and that downward slope is continuing steadily into early 2026.
Okay, so the curve has genuinely bent. But if we are, moving in the right direction, it kind of begs the next obvious question, why?
Right.
Is the drop in fatalities happening because fewer people are seeking out the drug, or is it because the drug itself is somehow becoming harder to get?
Yeah, and the University of Maryland criminology study, led by Peter Reuter, it addresses that exact dynamic.
Oh, perfect.
And their conclusion is striking because The demand side of the economic equation has not wavered.
Really, people still want it just as much.
Yeah, we can track demand by looking at the street price of the drug, which has remained remarkably stable. Because think about it, if millions of users were suddenly abandoning opioids, the market would flood and prices would just crater.
Oh, sure, basic supply and demand.
Exactly. Instead, the researchers found that the global supply chain has been severely fractured.
Yeah, when I was reading through the stack, the mechanics of that supply chain disruption were just fascinating to me. Because the cartels in Mexico, primarily the Sinaloa and the Jalisco New Generation cartels, they manufacture the finished fentanyl,
Right.
but they don't, synthesize the base ingredients from scratch. They rely heavily on precursor chemicals exported by these massive, large-scale chemical suppliers in China.
And that is exactly where the bottleneck occurred.
Yeah.
The Chinese chemical industry is massive, and for years, these dual-use precursors operated in this sort of regulatory gray area. But international pressure finally reached a tipping point.
Right.
Chinese regulators have recently faced mounting mandates to comply with United Nations counter-narcotics treaties. And to maintain their standing in the legitimate global pharmaceutical market, the Chinese government was basically forced to implement much stricter export controls. Yeah, strict export controls and domestic scheduling on these very specific precursor chemicals.
So essentially, the administrative red tape in Asia literally starved the illicit labs in North America.
It did. And the DEA's 2025 assessment quantifies that exact supply shock. Because in 2024, the DEA recorded a 29% drop in fentanyl seizures compared to the previous year,
Wow.
alongside a 24% reduction in the seizure of fake prescription pills. But the most telling indicator of a cartel supply chain in distress is actually the purity level.
Right, because they don't have enough of the real stuff.
Exactly. Because cartel chemists are struggling to source the necessary precursors, they are heavily diluting their product. DEA lab testing found that street pills seized in 2024 contained only about 1/3 of the actual fentanyl compared to pills seized in 2023.
That's insane. And the most compelling part of that University of Maryland research for me wasn't even the macroeconomic trade data. It was their methodology.
Oh, yeah, the Reddit study.
Yes. A PhD student named Casey Vangelov basically bypassed official government channels entirely and just analyzed the fentanyl subreddit. She mapped how anonymously posting drug users were talking about the market.
It's so smart.
It really is. She tracked the use of the word drought. And historically, a true drought in the synthetic opioid market is almost unheard of. But she found that in 2023, users on that forum were employing the word drought 10 to 15 times more frequently than in previous years.
It is just a brilliant application of sociological criminology. The researchers used the active street-level population as this network of real-time economic sensors.
Yeah, the best way I can picture this is it's like trying to track the macroeconomic impact of a global wheat shortage by scraping Yelp reviews for local bakeries,
Yeah.
And just counting how many people are complaining about a lack of croissants. The users on the street felt the downstream impact of international UN treaty compliance before the official law enforcement data had even finished compiling.
Exactly. And that grassroots ethnography validates the massive drop in DEA seizures.
Right. But that raises a massive logical paradox that I just couldn't shake while reading these sources.
Okay, what's that?
Well, if the cartels have 29% less fentanyl to traffic, and the pills they do manage to press are only 1/3 as pure as they used to be,
Yeah.
shouldn't overdoses be plummeting even faster than 21%? If the primary lethal ingredient is in a historic drought, why are 70,000 to 80,000 people still dying annually?
Well, this raises an important question about illicit drug economics. When a highly addictive substance becomes scarce, the suppliers do not simply close up shop.
Right, they still want to make money.
Exactly. They attempt to stretch whatever limited supply they have. So because pure fentanyl is harder to synthesize right now, local dealers and cartel distributors are turning the drug supply into an incredibly toxic, unpredictable cocktail.
Ugh.
They're cutting the weakened fentanyl with alternative, often cheaper, and just wildly dangerous adulterants.
Basically creating a Frankenstein drug supply to compensate for the missing precursors.
Precisely. And to understand why people are still dying at such high rates, we have to look at the pharmacology of these specific adulterants. The most prominent is Xylazine. This is a veterinary central nervous system depressant. It's an animal tranquilizer.
Which is just terrifying.
It is. It is not approved for human use at all. Cartels use it because fentanyl has a very short half-life, right? The high only lasts about 30 to 40 minutes. But Xylazine extends the sedative effect, mimicking the longer-lasting high of heroin.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. In Connecticut, the lethal combination of xylazine and fentanyl peaked in 2024, appearing in 34.7% of all overdose deaths.
And the true terror of xylazine, from what I read, is that it completely ignores our primary overdose reversal tool.
Yes.
Because xylazine is an alpha-2 adrenergic agonist and not an opioid, Naloxone, or Narcan, has absolutely zero effect on it.
Right.
So you can reverse the fentanyl portion of the overdose, but the patient remains heavily sedated and respiratory compromised from the tranquilizer.
Exactly. Which forces first responders to manage this complex multi-drug toxicity right there in the field.
Yeah.
And preliminary data for 2025 shows xylazine might finally be dropping down to about 13% in Connecticut, but the cartels simply pivot to the next chemical.
Right. They just find something worse.
Yeah, the 2025 and 2026 data highlight a terrifying surge in carfentanyl.
The elephant tranquilizer.
Yes.
Wow.
Carfentanyl is a fentanyl analog that is approximately 100 times more potent than standard fentanyl.
100 times? I can't even wrap my head around that.
And it's 10,000 times more potent than morphine.
Oh my God.
It is highly lipophilic, meaning it crosses the blood-brain barrier almost instantaneously and binds to the opioid receptors with massive affinity. It's just incomprehensibly lethal.
Yeah.
In Connecticut alone, carfentanyl contributed to 31 deaths in 2025, which basically tripled the fatalities from the year prior. And on top of that, we are seeing a spike in designer benzodiazepines, specifically bromozolam, which caused 42 deaths in Connecticut in 2025.
So the cascading effect of this Frankenstein supply is that it has completely cannibalized every other illicit drug market.
Oh, entirely.
Like just 5 years ago, if you looked at a DEA opiate exhibit, heroin was the primary drug in 66% of the samples.
Right.
But the 2024 DEA assessment shows that dynamic has flipped completely. In 73% of the heroin fentanyl samples tested, the primary drug was simply fentanyl.
Yeah, over 80% of all heroin-related deaths now involve fentanyl.
It's nearly impossible to find unadulterated heroin anymore. And the exact same contamination is ravaging the cocaine supply, too.
Yes.
In Connecticut, cocaine-involved deaths hit nearly 60% in 2024, driven heavily by this fentanyl cross-contamination.
The pharmacological landscape is literally unrecognizable compared to a decade ago.
What this means for you, or, your kids or anyone listening to this right now, is that the era of the casual user is unequivocally dead.
Completely.
You cannot buy a pill through social media and assume it is a diverted pharmaceutical painkiller or just a clean party drug. A single pill could contain a fraction of the expected fentanyl, or it could be loaded with an elephant tranquilizer, a veterinary sedative, or a synthetic benzo.
Right. Which brings us to the most vital realization of this entire deep dive, I think.
Yeah.
If the illicit drug supply has never been more toxic, more unpredictable, or more difficult to reverse in an emergency,
Yeah.
the fact that overdose deaths are dropping at all is a monumental achievement.
Right. If the cartels are actively making the drugs worse, but fewer people are dying, how is the demand side adapting to survive this?
Well, the decline in mortality is a direct reflection of a profound paradigm shift in our medical and community response. We are finally seeing the widespread normalization of medication-based treatment for opioid use disorder.
Like what, exactly?
This primarily involves buprenorphine and methadone.
Right. Let's explain the actual mechanism there, because it's brilliant. Buprenorphine is what neurobiologists call a partial agonist. When someone takes it, the medication binds incredibly tightly to the mu-opioid receptors in the brain, but it only partially activates them. It essentially acts like a nicotine patch for an opioid addict.
That's a great way to put it.
It completely stops the crippling physical withdrawal and those physiological cravings without producing the euphoric high. But more importantly, because its chemical bond to the receptor is so incredibly strong, it acts as a blockade.
Yes.
If a user slips up and takes fentanyl, the fentanyl physically cannot latch onto the receptors because the buprenorphine is already occupying the space.
It stabilizes the brain's neurochemistry, allowing the patient to actually rebuild their life.
Oh.
And, the way we deliver this medicine has fundamentally changed too.
How so?
Previously, if a patient survived a severe overdose and was revived in the ER, they were often just medically stabilized and handed a piece of paper with a referral to an outpatient rehab clinic.
So they were just sent right back out.
Exactly. Sent back into the environment that triggered the overdose during their highest window of vulnerability.
That makes no sense.
It didn't. But today, emergency departments are increasingly initiating buprenorphine treatment immediately, right there on the hospital bed.
Wow.
Yeah, stabilizing the patient's cravings before they are ever discharged.
closing that highly lethal gap in care. And this institutional shift is being mirrored by a massive grassroots adaptation among the users themselves, right?
Oh, absolutely.
The sociological data notes that drug users are intensely aware of this Frankenstein supply. There is a surging adoption of fentanyl and xylazine test strips to verify the chemical makeup of their supply before ingestion.
Yeah.
And there is also a community-wide cultural push toward harm reduction, specifically the practice of never using alone, ensuring someone is always physically present to administer naloxone if a batch is contaminated.
The community resilience really is profound. But we must view this progress through the lens of infrastructure and demographics.
What do you mean?
Well, the public health data from Connecticut makes it painfully clear that this crisis and the resources to fight it are distributed unequally. Throughout the entire epidemic, males have suffered significantly higher mortality rates than females. But the racial and geographic disparities truly expose the gaps in our medical infrastructure.
Yeah, looking at the Connecticut numbers, the mortality rate for the non-Hispanic Black population surged dramatically in 2020.
It did.
It hit an astronomical 65.3 deaths per 100,000 people and stayed at that catastrophic level for 3 brutal years. It wasn't until 2024 that their mortality rate finally began to recede down to 46.4.
And that multi-year delay is a direct symptom of the supply shift we discussed earlier.
Okay, how so?
When the illicit supply abruptly changes, say, when xylazine suddenly contaminates the local market, affluent urban centers often have the rapid medical infrastructure and the specialized harm reduction tools to pivot and educate their populations.
Right, they can react quickly.
Exactly. Historically marginalized or deeply rural communities simply lack that immediate elasticity. The DEA's 2025 threat assessment highlighted this vulnerability explicitly when detailing Operation Overdrive on the Blackfeet Reservation in Montana.
Oh man, that case study was staggering. The Blackfeet community comprises only 7% of Montana's overall population, yet they were absorbing a vastly disproportionate percentage of the state's fatal opioid overdoses.
Yeah.
The cartel supply networks targeted the reservation specifically because the rural medical infrastructure was highly vulnerable. The DEA had to partner with tribal and local law enforcement for a highly targeted operation just to dismantle the specific networks funneling fentanyl and meth into that area.
Which resulted in 11 federal indictments.
Yeah.
It really underscores that a national drop in overdose deaths does not mean the fire is extinguished in every single neighborhood.
Definitely not.
No.
So synthesizing all of this, we have a global supply chain drought forced by UN compliance, we have an aggressive expansion of grassroots harm reduction, and we have a structural shift in how our emergency rooms treat the neurobiology of addiction. All of these factors are locking together to finally bend the mortality curve downward. But reading through the final source in our stack, here is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
What if there was a pharmacological breakthrough that could alter the landscape entirely?
You are referring to the clinical vaccine trials.
Yes. This is the breaking medical news from January 2026. Phase I human trials for a fentanyl vaccine have officially commenced in the Netherlands with 40 participants.
It's amazing.
This is no longer a theoretical white paper. It is actively being tested in human arms right now.
And the development out of the University of Houston, spearheaded by Dr. Colin Hale, it represents a massive leap in addiction immunology.
Okay, walk us through it.
To grasp why this is so groundbreaking, we have to examine the cellular mechanism of the vaccine itself. The human immune system naturally ignores tiny synthetic molecules like fentanyl.
Right, it doesn't see it as a threat.
Exactly. So to force the body to recognize the threat, the researchers engineered a hapten carrier conjugate.
Meaning they took a tiny piece of the fentanyl molecule and attached it to a massive protein carrier that the immune system is already hardwired to attack.
Yes. The vaccine consists of 3 highly engineered components. First is a synthetic fentanyl fragment.
Okay.
It is just a structural piece of the molecule. It contains no active drug, cannot induce a high, and cannot cause respiratory depression.
Just a dummy piece, basically.
Exactly. Second, they chemically bond that fragment to CRM-197, which is a deactivated diphtheria toxin widely used as a safe carrier protein in childhood vaccines.
Ah, okay.
Finally, they introduce an adjuvant called DMLT, which is derived from modified E. coli toxins to hyperstimulate the immune response.
Wow. So reading through the immunology of this, the best way I can picture it in my head is to think of the human body as a highly exclusive nightclub, okay?
I like this.
The bloodstream is the line outside the club. In a normal overdose scenario, the fentanyl molecule rushes right past the velvet rope, crosses the blood-brain barrier, which is the VIP room, and shuts down the party, basically arresting your respiratory system.
All right, game over.
But with this vaccine, the diphtheria toxoid tricks your immune system into manufacturing millions of specific anti-fentanyl antibodies.
Yes.
And these antibodies act as an army of bouncers. As soon as the actual fentanyl enters the bloodstream, the antibodies recognize its chemical structure, tackle it in the line outside the club, and physically bind to it.
Which changes everything.
Because the resulting molecular cluster becomes too physically large and bulky to fit through the doors of the blood-brain barrier.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the pharmacokinetics.
Yeah.
It is entirely a game of molecular size and binding affinity. In the preclinical rat models, the vaccine-induced antibodies successfully sequestered the fentanyl in the bloodstream and blocked it from entering the brain entirely.
Wow.
Yeah, preventing both the euphoric high and the fatal respiratory depression.
So the fentanyl just gets processed by the kidneys and flushed out of the system without ever touching the brain's receptors.
Exactly. It is a stunning achievement. But as scientists, we must ground this in reality. A Phase I trial is strictly designed to evaluate baseline safety and dosage in healthy humans, not clinical efficacy in the addicted population.
So it's still early days.
Very early. The ensuing Phase II and Phase III trials, followed by the rigorous FDA approval process, will require several years. Furthermore, as the researchers themselves emphatically state, this is not a panacea.
Right, it doesn't cure the underlying trauma or the systemic poverty or, the psychological behavioral loops that drive substance use disorder in the first place.
Exactly. The vaccine is designed to be an additional, powerful tool in the harm reduction toolkit. It will function as a pharmacological safety net, best utilized alongside intensive cognitive behavioral therapy, community support structures, and existing medications like buprenorphine.
But just possessing that specific safety net, knowing that brilliant minds are attacking this generational crisis from a purely immunological vector, it offers a profound sense of hope.
It really does. It provides the medical community with a tangible reason to believe we can eventually out-engineer the lethality of the illicit market.
So let's zoom out and look at the vast landscape we have covered today. We initiated this deep dive with a singular question. Have fentanyl overdose deaths actually gone down since 2021? And the data gives us a definitive yes.
Yes, it did.
For the first time in an agonizing decade, fentanyl mortality is experiencing a significant, sustained decline. We are tracking under 100,000 deaths a year, with late 2025 showing a 21% national drop, and states like Connecticut recording over a 26% reduction.
And we can trace the complex causality behind that drop, too. It is a confluence of international regulatory pressure choking the Chinese precursor supply chain, combined with highly adaptive grassroots harm reduction, and a systemic evolution in how our emergency medical infrastructure treats the neurobiology of addiction.
But that optimism remains heavily cautioned. We are still losing tens of thousands of lives annually to an illicit supply that the cartels are aggressively contaminating with xylazine and carfentanyl just to compensate for their chemical drought.
Yeah, the overarching landscape is shifting favorably, but the immediate street-level reality remains incredibly volatile. The era of the casual user is over, and the vigilance demanded from both medical professionals and everyday citizens is higher than ever.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to consider as we close. We have documented exactly how ruthlessly adaptable these global trafficking networks are. If this 2026 vaccine proves highly effective and functionally cancels the fentanyl high for struggling users,
Right.
and if the UN treaties successfully eradicate the Chinese precursor pipeline, will the cartels simply concede the market and walk away?
That's the big question.
Or will they abandon the opioid class entirely, utilizing their vast illicit laboratory infrastructure to engineer a completely new non-opioid synthetic nightmare? A chemical profile that our current vaccines, our buprenorphine treatments, and our naloxone sprays simply cannot touch.
It really highlights the perpetual high-stakes arms race of global illicit drug economics.
Yeah. When a lethal dose is merely 12 tiny grains of salt, the next synthetic threat might be even smaller. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay incredibly vigilant, and most importantly, look out for each other. We will see you next time.
Don't forget to like and subscribe for the next episode on While We Were Distracted.